Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jaw and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
All right, we wanted to start off the show this week talking about the SharePoint vulnerabilities that were talked about last week. It was all in the news. Microsoft released a blog detailing how to remediate and hunt for these vulnerabilities for SharePoint. There's also an MSRC blog, so multiple different blogs. CISA released guidance as well. And before we get into it, since we are going to be talking about Microsoft, we normally have a disclaimer for those of you who listen to the show. Both Adam and I work for Microsoft. And Adam, if you want to just run through it real quick.
Yep. Andy and I both work for Microsoft in our field security sales business. We do the show outside of work on our own time and self-fund the show. So the opinions you're about to hear are Adam Brewer and Andy Jaw talking about what we know and are not the opinions of Microsoft Corporation. With that, on with the show.
So it was really interesting when Microsoft releases stuff like this. There are certain things because, in this specific case, there are definitely some things that we are allowed to say in our field sales. They publish guidance and everything for us. So we're not going to deviate too much, but this is all public knowledge if you haven't heard from the blogs themselves as well as the CISA guidance. And what I am super impressed with is the blog was actually published on 7/19, so July 19th, which was actually last Saturday. And I remember seeing emails over the weekend, like with the exclamation mark and all this other stuff coming through, not like paying too much attention to it, but I definitely saw it, read it, kind of skimmed over the guidance. And I was like, okay, and I started also seeing some chatter from my coworkers about, are we supposed to proactively reach out to our customers? And there was some different guidance on whether or not we should proactively reach out, or if people are going to ask about it, then we give them some guidance. And so, but what I was impressed with was just how fast Microsoft, in general, responded to what they saw, released a patch almost immediately, and then provided guidance, over a weekend, so that Monday morning, when people returned back to work, they were able to have that guidance ready and start the process of remediation. And so just to get into a little bit of what was going on, essentially there's two CVEs. One is a spoofing vulnerability. One's a remote code execution, which we all know is really bad. They only affect on-premise SharePoint and not SharePoint Online. So if you're hosting SharePoint servers on-premise, then this would affect you. The two CVEs are 2025 49706 and 49704. So as part of the investigation, Microsoft was able to attribute the active attacks to two Chinese nation state actors, Linen Typhoon and Violet Typhoon, that were targeting internet-facing SharePoint servers, and another China-based threat actor, Storm 2603, that were exploiting the vulnerabilities to deploy ransomware. There's mitigation in both of the blogs. In the second one, which is kind of talking about the on-premise exploitation and not part of the initial MSRC blog, the second one goes into a lot more detail. But just in the first one and in the second one, the guidance is pretty similar. First of all, use supported versions of on-premise SharePoint servers. And all the patches that were released were for all supported SharePoint servers, and that is the subscription edition, SharePoint 2016 and 2019. So those are the supported versions, and the patches were released for those. Update all the security updates that were released. Make sure that you have Defender for Endpoint or an equivalent threat solution deployed for those SharePoint servers. Ensure that the anti-malware scan interface is turned on and configured correctly. That's specific to Defender antivirus, but of course, if you have an equivalent threat solution, make sure that active malware scan is turned on. And then finally, rotate SharePoint server ASP.NET machine keys. And in the second blog, which, we'll have all these links in the show notes if you haven't seen them, there's IOCs that are listed to track for the attack. A thing that I had never seen before is there's a list of Defender XDR coverage. So it actually goes through a little grid and shows you here's the attack, and this is the updated signatures or things that Defender XDR is actually looking for. Like we usually tell customers, yeah, we've updated the intelligence or the machine learning in the XDR coverage to cover this, but this actually lists it out, which was actually kind of cool to see. So if you're using Defender XDR, we show you the graph or the chart of what's been updated specifically for this attack. There's also a list of CVEs to track if you for your vulnerability management, as well as Defender External Attack Surface Management, which is like a product that's very similar to Shodan. It'll scan your external egress IPs or your certificates or your domains and make sure that if anything's getting attacked from those avenues, that you'll have something to look at. And then, of course, hunting queries for Defender XDR, TI mapping, threat intelligence mapping analytics, and queries for Sentinel as well. So a lot of information in these blogs. If you are hosting on-premise SharePoint servers, I'm sure you've already seen the news, but just in case you haven't, make sure that you are taking proactive steps to mitigate this.
Yeah, a couple of interesting notes here just to add some color commentary to what Andy shared. Andy, you mentioned inside of Microsoft, sometimes we are told only respond reactively. So if a customer reaches out and asks us about something, here's how we can respond. Here's some pre-built talking points to share with them based on potential questions they may ask. So it's all ready to go, and we're being consistent in our messaging. Rarely are we encouraged to reach out proactively. And actually on Sunday night, about 5 p.m., I was actually editing last week's podcast, and I had my work email open on another PC, and I saw the message come in, and I reviewed it because, again, like you, Andy, I was curious, like, what's all this about? This is a lot of noise over the weekend. Andy and I's jobs generally are not nights and weekends kind of jobs. And I saw a message saying, hey, here's what's going on. Please reach out proactively to your customers, which I immediately did. I have distribution lists for all of my cybersecurity contacts at all my customers. So I blasted this out to my 16, 17 different customers and about 150 different contacts across them, letting them know, hey, here's the latest, here's the blogs, here's the mitigation steps, and agree. Obviously, I always say on this show, the goal is to write perfect code that is always secure all of the time. But that's not reality. So then at the end of the day, it becomes, how do you respond to it? How quickly, how effectively, how transparently? And again, we said at the disclaimer, where we work, but I'm proud of how we've responded to this. And of course, the goal is to write more secure code in the future. But when you don't, respond quickly, communicate well, get the word out, get the patches out. I think this has been handled pretty well. A couple other just notes on here as well. Supported versions. So supported versus unsupported. Just want to be kind of clear on this too, in terms of like how Microsoft thinks about it. If a product is supported or not is a binary concept. So it's 1 or 0, it's on or off. Either it is supported or it is not supported. And when a product is unsupported, that means we've freed up our teams not to look at it anymore. When a vulnerability comes out, they're not checking to see if an unsupported version is vulnerable. Because it's unsupported, it doesn't matter. We're not going to do anything about it anyways, except in extremely rare cases, like when we patched Windows XP when the National Health System got hit in the UK many, many years ago now, like 8-9 years ago. But otherwise, like when it's unsupported, SharePoint Server 2013 is just as unsupported as MS-DOS 5.0. SharePoint Server 2013 is just as unsupported as Windows Me. Like, even though it just went out of support in the last couple of years, at this point, it's not supported. And so I did have customers say like, well, are these versions vulnerable? And my point to them was, number one, assume breach. You should absolutely assume it's vulnerable. Number two, it's been vulnerable to a bunch of other stuff because it hasn't received security patches in years. And number three, I don't think you're going to get an answer on that because it's unsupported. Even going to go spend time like chasing our tails on, is this vulnerable? Because we're not going to patch it anyway. It's not really relevant to the conversation. So I know everyone listening to this show is probably not our culprits here, right? But if you discover in your company like there are unsupported versions running or floating around, like just keep in mind whether it went out of support 6 months ago or went out of support 6 years ago, or 16 years ago, it's equally as unsupported. Like Microsoft's been around for 50 years. There's a lot of stuff that's unsupported now. And we just have to stay current. I mean, this is Security 101, which again, our listeners know, and you need to educate your business on the risks of continuing to run something that's unsupported. And then one last note here, a little more color, to clarify the difference between SharePoint Online, which is a SaaS offering, fully managed, fully run by Microsoft, versus any SharePoint server installation. A lot of these blogs have all said on-premises, but I want to clarify a point there. If you're running SharePoint server in Azure IaaS, it is still included in the need to update it and patch it. Like if it's in IaaS, you're responsible for all the care and feeding and patching of it, and it is still vulnerable. So on-premises is a bit of a misnomer. That more kind of means less of a data center that sits in your headquarters, and it means in infrastructure you control. So just want to clarify that point too, because some people took that very literally, like, oh, well, I have SharePoint server running in Azure. Does this apply? Yes, it applies. And it applies if you're running in AWS or GCP or OCP or OCI or Alibaba. Like, doesn't matter where you're running it. If it's SharePoint server that's within your control, then yes, you need to get it updated and follow all this guidance as well. So those are my three things to add some color to this conversation. But again, by the time you're listening to this on Tuesday, July 29, hopefully you're all buttoned up here and this is already in the rearview mirror. But if you have additional work to do or you're still hunting for a SharePoint server in your environment, please follow these mitigation steps and we'll get you to a better place.
One of the most interesting responses to this attack was actually, in our internal Signal chat that Adam and I have with a bunch of our friends who are in IT. They posted this from the sysadmin Reddit subreddit where someone was talking about this CVE, and the post was titled, "Anyone else low-key panicking about what's actually sitting in SharePoint?" So I wanted to just spend a couple minutes talking about this because, yes, patching SharePoint, that's easy. The infrastructure part is easy. Like we just deploy the patch, upgrade SharePoint, whatever it is. That should have been done last week. I think the bigger question is what this gentleman, whoever this poster is talking about here is what kind of data do you actually have sitting in your on-premise SharePoint? And I think data protection, again, Adam and I have kind of hammered this point over the course of our podcast, and we've basically seen this at customers where data protection has not been something that has been at the top of the information security, the list of things that need to be done, mainly because it's difficult. I think that's the biggest thing. It's not like difficult to implement security controls. It's difficult to govern and to keep going.
It's a human problem too. It's a business problem. It's bigger than just technology. The technology is a tiny little piece of it.
Yeah. I mean, like if you think about where your critical data sits, it's in HR, it's in engineering, it's in legal, it's in all sorts of different areas. And you have to get those folks, to partner with you to figure out what is actually critical and what is not, and then look at ways to protecting that. And then, of course, with the AI boom, that has kind of bubbled up into more of a critical need because people are copying code and tossing it into ChatGPT, or they are, asking. I was actually just talking to my wife about this, who's a physician, and she gets people who just copy and paste like their symptoms and stuff into ChatGPT and basically giving it PII and HIPAA information to, train their models on the back end. She's thinking about using a application to listen in on her conversations and then take notes for her.
Mm-hmm.
And
which, by the way, Microsoft is one of the vendors in that space through our Nuance acquisition. Nuance offers a product for clinical scenarios. Just again, being fully transparent, where you can effectively, physician and their patient can have an iPhone in the room that's capturing the two-way conversation and will build at least the majority of the encounter notes for their charting and everything. And then the doctor can go review it and modify it and make sure it's correct and do that human review. But it saves a lot of time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I asked her, like, is this a specific product for medical personnel? Do you know if when the data is recorded and transcribed, is it used to train the AI model on the back end? All these kind of questions that cybersecurity folks would think about that, like, maybe a physician wouldn't. She just wants to like get something to take notes, right? And so this is all like, again, kind of, I'm diverging a little bit, but basically about data security. And if you have SharePoint Online, do you know what's in it? Like, are you able to, do you have some sort of DLP scanner? Do you even know what is being stored there? And if not, I think that is by far the bigger issue of data governance and data security, regardless of the infrastructure. Yeah, patch the servers for sure, but you also need to know what's there and start to govern that data. And if you're not, I mean, there are tools out there like, just as an example, Purview. You can extend that any label that you have in Purview can be extended to on-premise file shares, on-premise SharePoints through the information scanner. And you can automate labeling as well as part of some of the licensing. So it does depend on what you have for licensing with Microsoft, but it's available. Those tools are available. And if you don't have them, maybe start thinking about getting something like that to try to govern, because I think that's the bigger issue, is what is actually sitting in your on-premise SharePoint if it gets compromised, right?
Absolutely. And Andy, I think you hit all the high points. So I'll wrap up so we can move on here. But in general, on-premises SharePoint does not have as strong of tools for know your data purposes. In SharePoint Online, those are super robust at this point. The Purview team has been iterating like crazy. And so there's really powerful dashboards and tools to get a great bird's eye view of what's all in SharePoint Online. What is the sensitivity of it? What kind of content is in it? What kind of triggers does it tee off for? Is there, like you said, PHI, PII, HIPAA protected data, ICD-9, ICD-10, to use a bunch of like healthcare terms, but also the canonical examples, social security numbers, credit card numbers, even more complicated detections as well. It can read off all of that. SharePoint Server is not as strong in that space. So in general, if you're still running SharePoint Server, hopefully that is for a very targeted use case that has some sort of you must run it on premises, because frankly, the tooling is not as good to know your data in it. And the first step of securing anything is know what you're securing. What are you trying to do? And so you need to know what's in there. So when admins are kind of freaking out saying, oh, what's in SharePoint Server? If you don't know, that is a problem. And to Andy's point, by the time you hear this, you're 9-10 days after this was first announced, hopefully you're buttoned up on your patching. But then the next step comes on that rationalization exercise of what is in SharePoint Server, what should be in SharePoint Server, what can we move to SharePoint Online where the controls are stronger and more powerful. And then, yes, there are ways to extend the sensitivity labeling to on-premises SharePoints using the Purview scanner that runs on-premises. It can crawl on-prem SharePoints and it can apply that labeling and protection automatically as well. So you do have some tools, but frankly, they're not as good. And that's just the limitations of cloud infrastructure that's been developed over the last 15 years versus an on-premises server that just doesn't have the scale and power of the cloud behind it. By the nature of running a server on-prem, it's more a targeted, focused use case. As opposed to when you have cloud infrastructure behind it, you can build more adjacent technologies. So certainly a good call out there of get your house in order from a patching and vulnerability perspective. And then the very next step is know your data and do that rationalization step. And I'll plug it further of everything that can be in SharePoint Online should be. The only thing in SharePoint Server at this point should be stuff that cannot be stored in SharePoint Online for regulatory reasons. That should be it. You should have a very targeted, very focused use case, and everyone should know what's appropriate to store in there. This shouldn't be, honestly, and again, there's layers of maturity to this, right? But the fact that someone's saying, like, what's in my SharePoint Server is concerning to me, because I feel like we're at the point in the maturity curve where the decision matrix should really be, unless it can't go online, it goes on-prem. And that's the teeny tiny little bit of our business. That's this one thing that has to be on-prem. And so you should know that, and your admin should even know that. Everyone should know that. So anyhow, we can move on from there, but that's a good discussion. And it's a good point to bring up as we're cleaning up the mess here. And moving on is continuing that effort on making sure that we secure our data, because that way, even if you do have the risk of vulnerabilities and attackers coming in, assume breach mindset we always talk about, we have done defense in depth. We have secured the data at the data layer, at the individual unstructured data level. And that way, even if the attackers break in, they have another layer of protection they would have to compromise before they could exfiltrate data. Wouldn't that be a good place to be? And you can get there. That's not a flying car. That's a real thing. So let's set our goals high and let's go achieve them.
All right. So this next story came across again as I was just browsing through cybersecurity news. There was some news about Clorox. So Clorox had a cyber attack back in 2023 that caused wide-scale disruption of their operations. Their products started to become short in supply. I think Adam and I might have mentioned it when it happened.
I think we did, because this was one of those rare cyber attacks where sometimes you don't see the fallout for it. You literally could go see this. You could go to your Target or your Walmart or your local grocery store, and you would notice that section was barren. Their stuff wasn't there. They literally shut down production lines for a long time and had a huge gap in their ability to produce product because of this. It was a devastating cyber attack. I mean, to the level of, in terms of visceral reality, probably only rivaled by, say, the MGM Resorts attack from a year or two ago, when you literally saw pictures of empty casino floors and all the slot machines with like error messages up and people unable to check in, people unable to go to their rooms, people unable to gamble, shutting down Vegas. When you shut down Vegas, it's noticeable. And this was more widespread across the country. So very noticeable attack.
Yeah. And I went back and looked at just the share prices back during that time. And right before the attack, it was at around $154 per share. And over the next 6 weeks, as the attack took place and they were trying to remediate things and get things back up and running, and they released some information that it was going to affect their Q4, their share prices fell to $116, which was a 25% loss over 6 weeks, which is, I think that's pretty significant.
That's pretty significant. And, you know, I have opined on this show that as we have gotten the world more accustomed to cyber attacks being a factor of everyday life, whether that's good or bad, that some of that risk of reputational damage and share price damage has diminished with time. This is an example that it can still tank your stock. Like, you still need to invest in cybersecurity. It is still a financial risk to your business and an operational risk to your business. As much as nowadays you get a letter in the mail every other day from some company who had your information that didn't take care of it. And we've become accustomed to that and almost numb to it. It can still have major repercussions on your business. So anyone listening who controls the purse strings, you still need to fund cybersecurity, folks.
Yeah. And so why they're in the news now is that they discovered their outsourced service desk, a company called Cognizant, didn't follow procedures. And so they're suing Cognizant for $380 million. $49 million of that is remedial costs that were previously reported by Clorox, and the rest of it is basically damages for
reputational damage, some of like the soft costs associated with it.
Exactly. Yeah. So what happened is essentially the attackers just called the help desk and to reset their passwords, to reset multi-factor authentication, both Okta and Microsoft Authenticator, and Cognizant did not verify the caller's identity. And so as I was reading this, my first reaction was, okay, Clorox is at fault because, you know, if you're outsourcing, you need to keep tabs on them and like actually make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do, have a process for them, you know, to verify. Maybe they didn't have a process, but supposedly there was a process that they were supposed to follow. So when a Clorox employee calls a service desk, the protocol is supposed to be they're supposed to give internal verification and a self-reset password tool called My ID. That's how it's supposed to be done. So there is self-service password resets that are available. And so they're supposed to do that first. Now, if that's not possible, then the service desk is supposed to verify the person's identity using the manager's name and the My ID username. And then the password could be reset, but the employee and the manager would be notified by email. And so when they reviewed the call logs for these attackers calling Cognizant, they noticed that the Cognizant employee just gave them the reset without verifying anything, and they reset their MFA without doing anything. And the other thing is that Clorox said that they held regular meetings with Cognizant to make sure that everyone was on the same page and following the same procedures. And Cognizant gave explicit acknowledgments, consistent reassurance that they were following Clorox credential support procedures, but apparently they were lying and they weren't doing that. As I read through the story, I was like, yeah, that is probably something that it's not really Clorox's fault per se. Like anytime you're outsourcing something, you're also outsourcing that risk. And so, like you're hiring them to assume that risk. And so I do think that they're at fault. What I didn't like was that apparently Clorox also fired their cybersecurity chief, their CISO, and gave a bonus to the remaining, staff, the C-suite. So, blaming the cybersecurity chief for something like this, it's an easy thing to try to do, but I'm sure, actually, I'm not sure. I would assume that the CISO is notifying the C-suite and the board of the inherent risks and all this other stuff. And so, I don't know if I like this reaction, but it is something I think that it's like a knee-jerk reaction, an easy one for a company to do is just to fire the CISO. But basically, that to me just signals to the industry, okay, we're going to try to protect as much as possible, but if there is an attack, just get your resume ready. And I think that's just it's not going to do well for the industry in general, how the reaction from Clorox here. So yeah, those are just a few of my thoughts. I think they probably did everything correct here and tried to do everything correct, but the company that they outsourced to didn't follow procedures. And we've talked about help desk security, there's a bunch of different ways you got to be able to verify, whether it's a live Teams call, you could do a FaceTime call, hold up an ID. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this, but and if they can't do that, like if you can't get into Teams, you can't do a FaceTime call or a Google Voice call or whatever it is, then you got to do it in person, right? You got to come in and reset it. Because I think that's just, if you can't self-service, you can't verify identity, you got to do it in person. There's several different fallbacks that you can go to try to verify, but you can't just blatantly reset passwords and MFA factors without verification and also without notification. It sounds like they had that here as well to notify when a password is reset, which I think is a good thing too. So yeah, it was interesting news here.
This is full of red meat, Andy. There's a lot of good stuff here. Microsoft's former CISO, recently retired, by the way, happy trails, Brett Arsenault, was fond of saying attackers don't break in, they log in. And yet another example where effectively they're asking for credentials and they're being gifted them, and then they're able to log in and wreak havoc. Help desk is, and human in general, remains the weakest link in cybersecurity. That's not news to anyone on this show. You're probably tired of hearing about it, but this is such a good reminder of the level of risk there. What's interesting about outsourcing is it does give you a throat to choke, and it gives you a way of clawing back some funds. Sometimes you have service level agreements with your various vendors and service providers. And if you run those services in-house, you don't have that mechanism. It occurred to me early on in my career when we moved to Exchange Online for the first time that previously, if email went down, and email had gone down at various companies I'd worked at before, and I'd been adjacent to it, either in help desk or directly working in the collaboration team, we were just costing the company money. And there was no way for the company to get any money back when we did get it back up. There's no throat to choke other than us. Now, they could come fire us, but stuff happens in IT, stuff goes down. You try to avoid it, but it does happen. And so ultimately, there is no way for the company to recoup the costs incurred by the downtime. And so one of the benefits to an outsourcing model is it does give you a throat to choke. Here in Clorox cases, I don't know if they're going to win all 380 million, but that honestly is probably not an outrageous sum between the hard costs of actual restoration and remediation, the lost sales from not having product on shelves or produced, the reputational damage, the stock damage. That's not this outrageous sum of well, that's out of touch with reality. and it does give them a throat to choke. And so ultimately, one of the things I learned very early in my career, I started at IBM, and I was dumbfounded that our VPN was provided by AT&T. And I was like, why do we have this AT&T VPN? Why is AT&T doing our VPN? And the answer was simple. We have an SLA with them. And if the VPN doesn't work, we can go get money back from them. If we ran our own VPN and the VPN doesn't work and people can't log in, there's nobody to go to. There's nobody to hold accountable other than internal teams. And sure, you could maybe fire some people, but does that really accomplish the goal? So I don't see this as completely going away. But I mean, Andy, you touched on all the direct cyber angle. I'm more looking at from the business angle of, does this completely scare people off from outsourcing? Probably not, because there is that angle of it gives someone else with contractual obligations and service level agreements and financial penalties the incentive to do the thing. But to your point, you are spreading your risk. You are sharing that risk with them now. And they have an obligation to do this correctly. And this is such a weak link that everyone needs to make sure you're really buttoned up on and auditing and checking, just like you would do a red team exercise or bring in someone to do that sort of ethical hacking and try to break into your environment. You need someone testing, pen testing your help desk security just as much. It's super critical to do these type of social engineering attacks, to try to tailgate into the server room or whatever, just as important. So definitely a critical note there as well. And then to your point, Andy, about the CISO being terminated as a scapegoat, that's a nuanced discussion that we probably don't have time to completely unpack here. I have argued on this show, and I just referenced in the last segment, how we are becoming more numb to general cyber attacks, and hopefully CISOs aren't losing their job for every single incursion, because ultimately we need to shift our mindset from we can never have an incursion to, if we can close the blast doors and limit the blast radius and prevent the attackers from doing much, that's a win today. It's not never let them get in. It's don't let them get to anything important or interesting or useful and shut them out before they do. And so there needs to be this range of response to that, where day-to-day run-of-the-mill attacks, probably not worth losing your job over. But there does become a certain point when you have such a pervasive attack that we don't have product on the shelves. Our purpose to exist is to put bleach on the shelf at Target, and we can't do that. At some point, maybe, yes, someone needs to lose their job. Like, I am not for the scapegoating of CISOs. Do not misunderstand me at all. But I think there is a range of we should accept, and we should educate boards of directors and C-suites to understand that things are going to happen and measure us on our response. Remember what I said about SharePoint at the top of the show, as opposed to just preventing the bad thing from ever happening, which is impossible. But at the same time, there is a level of this is bad enough that, yes, someone must be held responsible. There has to be some repercussions for this, because our company's reason to exist is not happening right now. And so that's kind of where I draw the line and think probably justified in this case. I'll take the contrarian angle from you. I'll say, if you can't put Clorox bleach on the shelf at Target, somebody needs to lose their job. So that's my opinion, but I agree. I do not like the scapegoating of CISOs. I think we need a more nuanced and robust understanding of the cybersecurity landscape today, and we need to reset what our goals are. And I've argued for years on this show that everyone in cybersecurity is too rotated on absolute protection and not enough on detection and response, because those are equally important. It's not all eggs in the protection basket. And if we get why that's so attractive, because if we block it from ever happening, we don't have to deal with detection and response. But ultimately, today, we need to be experienced practitioners at all three and good at all three phases: protect, detect, respond accordingly. So there's, again, a nuanced discussion here. That's why I said it's like red meat on the table. There's lots of fun stuff to discuss, but
Yeah,
a
definitely.
very interesting story for cybersecurity professionals to read, and check out the show notes and read some of the stories around this.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you kind of approached it from the organization and the business, which makes sense. But also, like, I was thinking, if you're working at a help desk or you're working for a company that is outsourced, because these are very common services. A lot of
Absolutely.
companies outsource their help desk to, it's not necessarily, an Indian company or a Chinese company or whatever. there are a lot of American-based companies that
Mm-hmm.
have help desks, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just very easy to hire people for that and entry level. And so if you work for this or you are a part of a company that does outsourcing, like this is something to pay attention to. And I'm
You
super
mentioned something interesting there too, real quick, before you put a pin in your point. I don't want you to lose it. There are cultural differences in how people kind of handle those conversations as well. And I have noticed that in different cultures around the world, there's this almost like service above all else mindset where if someone calls and asks me for something, I will fall all over myself to deliver that service to them. It's a cultural thing. And I'm not going to like pinpoint specific countries or whatever, but it's different where kind of in the United States, we have this more natural skepticism of someone's intentions. And in other countries, it's like, well, they asked for it and they sound important, so I must do this for them. But we deal with this at Microsoft sometimes where they will say like, well, the customer wants to do it this way. And we'll say, well, that's not the way it works. Or that's a really bad way to do it. You should push back. And that's so culturally difficult in some parts of the world to push back. And so when you're outsourcing these things and you need healthy skepticism on the caller, are you really who you say you are? And should I really do this thing you're asking? In some countries, that's so hard because culturally they've been trained to, if you ask me for this, I will do everything I can to deliver it for you. And that's the opposite mindset we need to have in these scenarios. And so that's an extra wrinkle we have to manage, especially if we have a global help desk.
Great point. Yeah, that nuance is definitely there. What I was going to wrap up with is I'm really glad that you mentioned pen testing it, because I had that thought. I was reading through this is if you're running regular, scenarios and tabletop exercises, this should be part of it. Have someone just call in and see if they'll reset a password, and if are they following, just do it as a blind test without letting them know that it's a cybersecurity tabletop exercise. So yeah, pen testing, tabletop scenarios, those are things that should be implemented into your regular defense cadence. All right, so the final thing that I wanted to talk about, I saw this, and it basically an IT worker carried out a cyber attack in retaliation for a company firing him, and it ended up crippling some of the company's function. The Spice and Tea Exchange hired Richard Clayton Wozniak as a system administrator in October of 2024. He was fired very shortly after, in January 14th of the following year. And within minutes of his firing, the company's firewall, their email, and their physical security was infiltrated and resulted in complete deletion of the company's data, which was detailed in the arrest warrant. A human resources executive at the company told the investigator that the position was being eliminated because he displayed very concerning behaviors while employed, such as having a short fuse. And the day that he was fired, he was working from home. These are all kind of details that I was thinking about as I was reading it. He's working from home. The HR executive called him to let him know he was fired, and the conversation lasted about 10 minutes. And so, according to the warrant as well, Wozniak made several threatening statements prior to terminating the call with the HR person. He said, "Your company is not prepared for what is coming your way." Almost as soon as he was fired, the company should have disconnected him from firewall and restricted access. And this was supposed to be done while the HR executive was still on the phone. But it became like this movie-like race between the IT employees, and Wozniak was just a step ahead of his former colleagues. He logged into the system at the same time, and Wozniak, quote unquote, overtook him and the entirety of the business email access. The company immediately lost access to company firewall and emails, and Wozniak also removed the firewall and obstructed business continuities. He left one of the laptops at the office, and when the colleague opened it, he was logged into his personal Chrome and Gmail accounts, and it was syncing with his other devices, and they were able to search through his search history and his personal emails, which had a bunch of stuff. And I just thought that this was super interesting. It's something that I think is always at the back of anyone's mind when they work in cybersecurity, when an IT admin gets terminated or if they change jobs. I think that's even harder because a lot of times when you're moving laterally within a company, there's not a good process for that at most companies. And so most people keep their permissions from their previous position and move to the next one. So I'll give a couple examples of how this was handled at my previous companies. And I think it's more anecdotal, but I think it's a good way to like think about it. So when I worked at Trek, I had access to a lot of different things. And when I decided to leave the company, I was deciding to leave. Matt Wood, who has been on this show, along with Dane Sanderson, who was my boss at the time, had a conversation between the two of them, and they basically determined the risk of me leaving and having access for those 2 weeks. Because a lot of times you could, if you're putting in your 2 weeks as someone in cybersecurity, you almost can assume that you're going to get walked out the door that day and lose access. Like, that's not uncommon or something out of the ordinary. But they had a conversation about risk for me keeping my access for the next 2 weeks. What would I be doing, with that access? Would I be a risk to the company? And they determined that it wasn't going to be a risk. So they let me stay those 2 weeks and continue to work. And then the day that I was leaving, I know that as soon as I walked through, like literally physically left the building, Matt was there to turn off my access. Like, as soon as I walked out, my email stopped working. Like, it was done. Everything got turned off. And same thing happened when I was working at Exact Sciences. My colleagues there had a conversation again about my level of access, if it would be a risk, and they again determined that it wasn't. So they let me stay on for, I think I was there for 3 weeks. I gave like a 3-week notice. And so I continued to work, have access. And then as soon as I left, same thing. So, and we did have a lot of, while I was there, had a lot of like, what do you call them? Like contested or like, firings essentially, right? Like, and we would work with HR. Like, HR would give us an update, like a heads up. Hey, we have a firing today for this person at this time. Like, we want their stuff turned off. And so you have to be on the ball and make sure that access is turned off. Usually, like, I was doing it like right when HR told me to do it, which was usually the start of the meeting. But with someone like, who has access and login credentials to like firewalls to, and maybe they're not like federated with an identity provider. When you have a bunch of different SaaS accounts that you have to disable, that can take time. It can get complicated. And so, if you're not federating your access with one identity to turn off, then that's something that you want to work with HR on and make sure that they're cognizant of that. Same thing when someone moves, like I had a domain admin in the one company that I was working at, moved from one position to another where he no longer needed domain admin, but he wanted to keep it, there's always a transition period to like maintain stuff. And so I made it a note, even though HR had already moved him, this is something, again, cybersecurity shops need to stay on and understand who your admins are, where the risk is, like it took like 2 or 3 months after he moved to his new position with me, like, every couple of weeks going to him, hey, do you still need your domain admin? Hey, do you still need, and finally there was at a point he was like, yeah, I don't think I need it anymore. I'm like, perfect. I went and disabled it right away, so and that's not something that HR told me to do. It's just, I knew he was an admin. I knew he moved to a new role. And, that's something that you need to stay on as someone in cybersecurity. So anyways, I thought this was interesting. It's definitely a warning for folks who might be firing, laying off, or, just for people leaving the company. It's a conversation that you need to have. If they are an IT admin, they have access to sensitive data. This guy, obviously he had some concerning behaviors, so that should have been a heads up right away that something bad was going to happen. So anyways, I'm not trying to like shame the company. It's just that, like, this is, we all learn from these type of incidents, right? Like, this happened to someone, like, we should make sure that we have our process buttoned up for this.
Yeah, absolutely. This is wild because, Andy, I've been through a couple of these too, both on both ends of it. I left an organization where I was the global administrator of the entire, Office 365, Azure, M365, everything, and gave 2 weeks notice to go to another organization. At the same time, one of the other global administrators was also leaving to go to the other organization. We had moved together to go reunite with our former director, who we dearly loved working for. And obviously recognize that's less than ideal, but at the same time, we recognize that in order to do an effective transition, if either one of us had left, the company would say, oh, well, you cross-train the other one. And the only way we would actually get the cross-training to the people it needed to go to, because we both knew we were leaving, was to do it at the same time. So they were really bent out of shape about it, understandably so. But otherwise, they would have told us to cross-train the other, and we'd sit there in the back of our mind going, yeah, but I'm walking out the door in another week too. So we're like, we have to do it together so they can actually recognize that this third person is who needs to get cross-trained. But they had a very difficult decision because we're both leaving. We weren't leaving under contentious terms, but we had an enormous amount of power.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, literally running the most mission critical system of all mission critical systems, email and cloud identity. And, we're able to maintain it throughout our entire transition until our last day, but had also been on the other end of it at companies. I was there once when a member of the C-suite was terminated and had to be like, they're going to try to take their book of business with them. You need to make sure that we delete all the moment they get pulled into this meeting before they can possibly copy it over or do anything else. And it's tough. I recognize how difficult these are. And in this scenario, of course, we all look at this and go, oh, well, what did they do wrong? How was I smarter than them? And, it's not entirely clear in the details of when exactly IT was starting to disable the access compared to when the phone call went out. Hopefully those were timed at the same time, like the phone calls at noon, you disable the access at noon. But we all know with things like access tokens, they can last for up to an hour ahead of time. And we've talked about layoffs on this show recently and how difficult those are. And we've been through two different kinds of layoffs at Microsoft over the last 2 years. In 2023, we did rolling layoffs for 2 quarters, and it was the worst thing ever because you didn't know if the guillotine was going to fall on you that day or not. You basically came into work scared for 6 months, wondering, when are the layoffs over? When are they done cutting people? Am I going to get impacted? And then this year they did them differently, where they laid off 9,000 people in one morning, very effectively and efficiently, which after all the complaining about the rolling layoffs, it's like, hey, isn't this an improvement? At least we did it all at once. Well, layoffs suck, period. I mean, that's Captain Obvious statement here. But it does remind us of different ways companies have done them. I know Google, people found out they were laid off because they couldn't log in the morning. And you say, well, that's so horrible of a way to find out. But for this person, in hindsight, probably us trying to do the humane, kind thing to do, put the company at risk. And that's where I balance, I want companies to treat people like people. We are not just disposable cogs in the machine. We have families, we have mortgages, we have needs too. Don't be cold and impersonal and put the company above all else all of the time. But at the same time, in a scenario like this, and now you see the blowback from it, the right thing to do for this person would have been terminate his access overnight and then call him and tell him at 8 a.m. the next morning, hey, you got let go. Your access is already disabled. You can bring your laptop to the office or whatever, or FedEx it to us, however they want to handle it. I don't, it doesn't matter. But it's one of those, I get the balancing act, the push pull here of we're trying to treat people with dignity and respect and empathy during one of the hardest days both management and individual contributor go through. And I recognize that, but then also protecting the business. It's hard. In some ways, I'm glad I don't have to deal with this stuff, Andy, because these are hard balancing acts. But I know Google definitely during one of their rounds of layoffs, a lot of them found out when they couldn't log in the morning because they had gotten terminated overnight, and it eliminated some of the opportunity for these kinds of mischief to occur. So look, there's no right answers to all of this. It's honestly a case-by-case basis and a privilege-by-privilege basis, and you have to make the decision that's right for you. For this gentleman who had demonstrated a short fuse and was being terminated because of it, that's probably when you go to more extreme measures. This person has a lot of privilege. They've demonstrated poor judgment in the past. We can't trust them. Terminate his access at 1 a.m. And then we'll wake up and we'll call him at 8 a.m. sharp when business opens and explain what happened. That's in hindsight. And like you said, Andy, we're all trying to learn from these scenarios. What can we do better? That's an example of it. And then, of course, in many other examples are things like privileged access, privileged identity management, requiring, say, another admin to approve your privilege escalation before you can do it, having controls in place where you need 2 admins to take certain actions or to do certain permanent deletions as much as possible, having offsite backups or backups that have different administrators, that this administrator can't go delete all the backups, those sorts of things you have to have in place, or immutable backups. to protect your business as well. Wow. Just another scenario and another wrinkle that we all knew was possible, but to hear it made real is concerning because these are so tough. We're trying to balance so many conflicting needs all at the same time. And I deeply empathize with the people having to make these decisions and take these actions because it's super hard for everyone.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you kind of mentioned, like terminating access before, but it does take a little bit of the human factor out of it. Cause like if they accidentally, log in and they realize my dad, like his password didn't work one day and he just assumed that he was getting laid off. That was like his assumption. And he
Dude, I've had it happen. Like stuff starts breaking on my, whatever. I can't get my email anymore. I'm like, oh God, did I get laid off today? Like it does pop in your mind now.
Yeah.
And it stinks. And in general, if you have a good parting or if you're doing like a mass layoff, that's probably not the most appropriate way to do it.
Yeah.
But again, I'm saying for this scenario,
for this particular one,
highly privileged person with poor judgment, with a short fuse, probably that's where you can justify it in your own mind and say, hey, look, we got to protect ourselves. I would love to do this in a more humane way, but this is a cut off the access in the middle of the night thing while they're sleeping. So they don't know and can't take malicious response.
And not only just IT access, but like, in this day and age, physical access to buildings. I would even like tell HR, hey, like their IT asset, we're just going to write it off as a loss. Cause like, I don't want to deal with this.
You don't
person.
want them to come back to the building. Yeah. Right.
So, physical access, like you might, who knows, like you might take with that kind of threat on the call, like maybe there's going to be a physical threat to the building,
Correct. Exactly. That's where you say the $800 would recoup from this laptop or whatever is not worth the risk to the people in the building. Just write it off. Agree.
All right. Well, that is our show for this week. We had some really good stuff here. Hopefully you guys got some stuff out of this. All the links to the topics that we talked about will be in the show notes. If you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about, our contact information is there as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.